Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the fourth and final webinar in our series of immediate response actions. Today, we're going to be looking at setting endpoints, demobilizing resources, and post-incident reviews. Unfortunately, you've just got me today. I was going to be joined by my Preparedness Solutions Manager, Mr. Jorge Pilay, but he is tied up with another meeting right now and will be joining us later in the webinar. So as we go through today, if you have any questions about any of the topics that we're talking about, you can do one of two things. You can raise your hand, take yourself off mute and just ask, or you can type it in the chat on the corner of the screen. We will take it from there. Okay, so what have we done so far? Well, during this webinar series, we've been looking at the 12 different steps that we would need to undertake immediately once an oil spill incident has happened. So we've been going through the initial assessment, raising the alarm, making those notifications, mobilizing your tier one, your immediately available response resources. So that's personnel and equipment. We've also been looking at how we would then set up our operations center, whether that's a on-scene commander center right at the location, or for larger incidents, if they're going to be managed by an incident management team, what that would look like. Then we'd look at how we would monitor how the incident's going, how we keep people updated to what's happening on the ground, and then how we're going to support the response. And I have to apologize in advance about the dog barking. It's Thursday morning here in Houston, which means it's garbage day. And I think my dogs feel that the garbage truck is hiding a team of ninjas coming to attack us, and they like to keep us safe. Then once we've set up our emergency operations center, we look at how we move from that reactive to the proactive phase. We set our goals and assign our tasks for the incident. Then again, the constant monitoring of how we make sure that what we're doing to deal with the incident is being effective. We're making sure that we're keeping records. Again, you're probably sick and tired of me talking about take notes, keep records, take notes, but it's absolutely key, not just during the response, but also in what we're going to talk about today, where we are going to look at how we close the incident down and then evaluate how well we did. We also talked about how we update our key stakeholders, so that whole engagement process to people outside of our immediate response team. But today, what we're going to look at is how we validate our recovery, which means how do we know when to stop? How we close the incident out, and then last but by no means least, how we conduct a post-incident review. How do we know this is where we stop? This is what we sought to achieve, and this is how we've achieved it. So how we measure those goals. So we're going to look at the first point, the setting response endpoints. Obviously, once an incident happens, we need to know what it is that we're trying to do. And if we can define this as early on as possible, that this is what we're trying to achieve, then we can all work towards that goal. So, first of all, response endpoints, exactly like it says on the screen there. We have to be as specific as possible when we're saying this is what we are looking to achieve during our response. This is the goal we're trying to get to. We can't just say we want to get this area as clean as possible. What does that look like? How clean was it before? What are we aiming for? So there's a couple of ways that we can do this, but generally an internationally recognized method of doing this is by using a shoreline, or if you're inland or offshore, wherever it is that you are, but we call it shoreline, the shoreline assessment process, or also shoreline cleanup assessment technique, SCAT. It's a step-by-step process that we can carry out. First, when we prepare for oil spill incidents, and secondly, actually during the response. So during the preparedness, if we know that we are in a certain location and we potentially could have an oil spill, it's very, very useful for us to know where do we think the oil is going to go. Now, obviously, there's a lot of methods in finding where the oil is going to go. For example, computer spill modeling, or we can use a more hands-on technique, which I've done for many members around the globe, where we can use some flotation devices, release them where we think the oil is going to be released, if this is on water, and then track where they go. For on land, we can use the actual cartography or the geography of that area, see where the oil is going to flow away from the source. Once we've done that, once we have an idea of the area that we're looking at, we can then divide it up into zones. What we're trying to do there is identify the most sensitive sites. And when I'm talking about sensitive, yes, obviously I mean things like mangroves and salt marshes, but also what about economic sensitivities? If they're ports, if they're tourist beaches, especially throughout the Caribbean, we want to understand what do we need to put a priority on to protect. Once we know, okay, this is where the oil is likely to go, these are the sensitivities that it could impact, we can then develop specific cleanup guides for that region. And because we've done this survey, because we've looked at that area prior to any oil impacting, we know where we're trying to go with the response. So that's our endpoint. For example, if this shoreline has this background level of refuge, shall we say, then we can look at that area and say, okay, so this is what it looks like now. So we know this is where we're trying to get to. And I recently did an IMO2 training in Trinidad with a team from Tiger Tanks and other organizations, where we actually went down and did this on a beach. Now, the beach had previously been oiled from an oil release a couple of years ago now. So they were able to do this survey and look, okay, so this is the state of this area now. So this is what we're trying to get back to, how it is right now. When we've got that, then we can make sure that we assign the different teams, the different groups to maintain that knowledge of that area. So obviously things change, whether it's a particular time of year, where there's another incident perhaps that's not related to our operations. But then when the incident does occur, one of the things that we want to do is complete this shoreline survey, especially when the oil has impacted that area. So how bad has that area been impacted? Obviously, we then feed that information into our emergency response or incident management team, and they will establish, okay, so these are the resources that we need, these are the methods that we're going to use, and this is how we check that what we're doing is being effective. Then second to last, obviously the post-cleanup inspections. We want to make sure that when that initial response has been completed, that we go back and make sure that we haven't missed anything. So this is particularly important in areas perhaps where the oil has been buried. where the tides have come in, brought additional sediment, and maybe put a layer of sand or mud over that initial oil. So it looks clean, but you dig down a couple of inches and there's oil. Or mangroves or other vegetation that the oil has been trapped in. When you look from the outside, it looks clean. But as soon as you get a high tide or strong weather conditions, that oil remobilizes and comes out. So these post-cleanup inspections, is there any remaining oil there? Once everybody has reached agreement that we have got this area back to how it was before the oil spill occurred, we can then sign off on these cleanup activities. Now, we're going to talk later on in this webinar. There are times when we're not going to get it back to how it was when we started the response, but to carry on with our response and cleanup activities is going to cause more damage than benefit. And if you'd like to find out any more information about completing these kind of techniques, All Spill Response has field guides, which lays out very simply, this is how you go through the process to complete one of these assessments. And you can see it on the bottom right-hand side there. And that's our cleanup guide. I will show you, it looks like this. There we go. You can download it from our website and you'll get more information there. So when we're looking at setting criteria for our endpoints, what does that look like? Obviously, it's very dependent on the incident type and severity. And a lot of this we can define during our planning process. We already know what our operation is. We already know the type of product, for example, that we're dealing with, whether it's crude oil, whether it's refined products. We already know, based upon our previous survey, where the oil is likely to go. Another thing that we know is what resources are immediately available to us, whether that means that we have them on site with trained personnel, or we have a contractor who would come in and assist us if we have that incident. Now, another thing that is very, very important for us to do is build relationships with our stakeholders. Now, stakeholders could be a number of things. That could be our partners or the companies or organizations that we work with, but also the regulators in the area that we work on or in. It's really important for us to build those relationships, invite them to our trainings, invite them to our exercises, so that they understand these are the processes and procedures we have in place, not only to prevent oil spills from happening in the first place, but also to deal with them if they do occur. Sorry. So once we've built those relationships, it's a lot easier for us to have that discussion about what is a realistic and achievable endpoint. I'm sure during our lives, we've come across people that we feel don't set realistic goals or don't think about what is achievable. And typically, those people are ones that we don't have a relationship with, that we haven't talked about. We haven't talked about the challenges or the benefits of operating in a certain area. But cleanup endpoints, there are four main things that we have to remember. And actually, you've really just got to remember the first one. When we're defining our endpoints, they've got to be clear, concise, and measurable. There's the famous quote when the Exxon Valdez happened, and the lead of the organization came up and said, we are going to leave this area cleaner than when we found it. It's a great soundbite, but how achievable is that? Is that being concise? Is that setting goals? Is that measurable? Obviously, what we have to be careful of is promising things that we can't deliver. And once we've started our response operations, we need to make sure that we are evaluating exactly what we are doing, how effective we're being, are we doing good, are we causing more harm to that area. Again, setting these endpoints should be done as early as possible during that response operation. And I know I've sat in so many drills and exercises and action events where people think if I write something down in paper, then that's set in stone and I can never change it. Well, that's not the case. Of course, once you get more information, you can modify what your end goals are, obviously with the agreement of the key stakeholders and other people working on that response. And we all know that once that initial response has finished, it's not just everybody pack up the equipment, we all go home and forget that it ever happened. We've got to make sure that we have this longer term monitoring program, making sure that there's no long-term impacts. Is there something perhaps that we've missed? Or is there something that we haven't thought about during that initial response that will need addressing later on? Okay, just before I start talking about this slide, I'd just like to welcome my boss, the Preparedness Solutions Manager for the Americas, Mr. Jorge Pilay, who has joined us now. So if you do have any questions, any queries, then please feel free to type them into the chat or raise your hand for either myself or Jorge to discuss later. All right, strategies. So we've got our endpoints. We know what we're trying to achieve. How then is the best way to make sure that we are going to achieve them? Communication. Communication is key. As well as recording all the information, another thing you're probably sick and tired of hearing me hang on about is clear communication, making sure that everybody who is involved in that response understands that this is what we're trying to achieve, so that they feel part of that movement towards that goal, which is absolutely vital to any response. And to do that, we do our continuous monitoring and then inform others. This is what we're doing. This is how well we're doing. This is what we're going to change. And anybody involved in any kind of emergency response, whether it's oil spills, whether it's hurricanes, civil unrest, medical, you have to know that your initial plan is not going to survive through the whole response. You need to be flexible and be ready to adapt your plans, because all the situations, all the incidents that we face evolve as we go through that response. But on a broad level, there's a hierarchy of cleanup endpoints. What are we aiming to achieve as we go through this cleanup stage? Obviously, initially, no visible oil. You go down to the impacted area and you can't see oil. The second stage, no more than background levels. This is where we're taking samples. We're starting that process where we're sending our samples off, we're having them analyzed, and they're coming back to us and saying, so this is the background. It might not be visible, but this is how much oil is still contained within sediment, for example. We spoke about oil being trapped, either buried under sand or sediment or in the vegetation. We want to make sure that those areas no longer release any oil. Typically, it will be a sheen that will come out that will affect sensitive areas, wildlife, or the local population, human health. Next, no longer rubs off on contact. So what do I mean by that? I mean that when you get your sorbent pad that we've spoken about before, it's very important in one of our tier 1 kits, that if you were to run your sorbent pad over, whether it's boulders, whether it's concrete, whether it's the vegetation, you can't see any oil left on that pad. And then last but not least, especially when we're talking about sheens, we want to make sure that we are not causing more harm than good. So if we're trying to remove oil from a particular area, but we're removing very little oil and creating more damage, then we have to know, okay, we are not benefiting the response or the environment by doing this. And that's very important, especially when we're talking about sheens. So this all sounds very good in theory, but does it work in practice? Well, yes. And here is an example of where it did work well. The Refugio oil spill in California in 2015, where crude oil, just over 100,000 gallons of crude oil was spilt from an underground pipeline. One of the benefits of the release being where it was, they already had a very good instant management and emergency response team structure, which would be able to mobilize very quickly. They also had great relationships. So the company, Plains All American Pipeline, had great relationships already with the Coast Guard, Fish and Wildlife, the county operators. So they were able to call them in and get everybody involved in that incident management team working towards the common goal. So things that worked well, rapid response. Because they had these great relationships, within hours, the key sensitive areas, if they could be closed, were closed. So fisheries, and a state of emergency was declared for the county. So not just that particular area, for the county. And if you think, that's a bit overkill, Tristan, why are they saying a state of emergency for the county? Well, if you think about, we're bringing equipment in, we're needing transport routes, we're needing to move around the area quickly. We need to keep people away from a certain site to prevent them putting themselves in danger. So this state of emergency really helped us do that and focus on the response without worrying about the dangers of secondary contamination or people putting themselves in danger. And there was a great community involvement. Obviously, nobody wants an oil spill to happen where they live. And there was a lot of interest, shall we say, that from the local community about how it's going to be dealt with. So the local community, as it said there, was activated, and we have volunteers come down to the beach. Now, they weren't involved in the actual response, so they weren't picking up oil on the beach, but we used them for other tasks, and that was to do reviews of areas that weren't impacted by the oil, but potentially could be. They also did things like provide food and water and shelter for the responders. It was quite hot when this happened, so we could only put responders on the beach for a certain amount of time before they needed some area to rest in. In that region as well, there was tribal and archaeological resources, so we made sure that we engaged with the local community to not only get their assistance in protecting these areas, but also finding out where was it appropriate for our responders to go and where wasn't it. And this incident happened 5 years after the large oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. So what benefited us at that time, there was a huge interest in how we responded to oil spills, and new techniques, new methods were coming in at that time. We were able to use those methods to make sure that we carried out the most effective response possible. Okay, so we're talking about endpoints. That's how we reach the endpoints that we're looking at. Now, once we've reached our endpoints, we then can look at the resources we have mobilized, look at the ones that we need, and look at the ones we can start demobilizing. So, obviously, demobilization, exactly what it sounds like. Once we don't need a particular resource, whether that's people, whether that's equipment, whether that's some of our supporting staff, we can stand them down, but it's got to be, like it says, in an organized manner. We don't want to find out that we stand a team down one day and then 2 days later we need them again. Very important, especially for organizations such as OSRL Response, where we're a global response agency. We can go anywhere in the world at any time. So our operations team can be called away, and we want to make sure that our team's rested and ready to go whenever that phone call comes in. So effective demobilization makes sure that not only do we keep costs managed, we can make sure that we're not tiring out our team. We're not having our team on a response for 3 months when really we could have started to lessen the amount of people after 3 or 4 weeks. The decision to demobilize resources is made at the incident management team level. So a managerial level, because these are the people that are having the communications with the key stakeholders, that know the goals, the endpoints that we are looking to achieve. Obviously, the final decision rests with the incident commander, but they make that decision based on inputs from all the other groups, from the operations, from the planning, from the logistics, from the finance, and the administration teams. They all work together to give our incident commander the right information to make sure that they can make the right decision. Like all things, there are steps in demobilizing resources. It starts and finishes with the incident commander. We have to make sure that they are the ones that authorize the demobilization. Key to that is how we identify what resources are no longer needed. And we do this again through a series of steps. Obviously, as we're doing our constant evaluation on how well the incident is being managed and responded to, we can identify we need these resources, we're not using these resources. And this is especially important when we over-respond, which we always try and do during those early stages. We understand the incident that's occurred, but we know that it could get really bad if certain things happen. For example, the hurricanes that we've experienced here in the US recently have made massive challenges to some of the response operations. Everything has to stop. And when you go back to that area, once a hurricane has passed through, obviously the landscape looks very, very different than when it did at the start. And we want to make sure that we still have those resources there just in case. But once we've identified, we've done a resource inventory, identified these are the resources we need to keep, these we can let go. We can then establish this demobilization priorities. For example, do we still need 3 aircraft to carry out overflights when we've confined the impact area just to 1 zone? We could demobilize 2, for example. We want to make sure that any of the resources that we send back are clean and ready to be used against this decontamination procedure. We want to make sure we're not doing secondary impacts where we're sending oil equipment away from the site and expecting it to be clean somewhere else. We already have our waste management process set up at our location. it's much more efficient and effective for us to use that process to clean up our resources before they leave the site. Another thing we want to do is communication. So coordinating with the agencies. Nobody wants to turn up ready for work the next day to find out the resources they were expecting to have are no longer there. We want to make sure that everybody's aware that we've identified these resources that can be demobilized, and this is what we're sending away and why. Obviously, with our logistics team, we're going to look at the transportation and logistics. How are we going to get the resources back to their storage? Is that going to be by road transport, by vessel, by air? We want to make sure that we're using the most effective and cost-effective method of getting those resources back. Documentation and reporting. When things have come off hire, where they're going to, how they're getting there. It's very important for us to make sure, especially within our incident management team, that we document all of this. And this is where the incident management system or incident command system has the forms and the documents that really aid us in that task. We run through exercises in OSRL Response's incident management system level 300 training, where we get our logistics team to plan through this process to make sure that when we do our post-incident review, it's really clear that this is the decision that was made. These are the resources that identified. This is how we sent them back. And this is the condition that our contractor or our agency or our supporting infrastructure received them in. So, as we know, not everything runs smoothly. Sometimes things happen that we don't foresee, but there's a couple of common challenges that we face. First, the communication challenges, making sure we have to make sure that all teams are aware that this is the process we're working through and we're demobilizing the equipment in a coordinated manner. So yes, we could be demobilizing this shoreline cleanup assessment team, for example, from this location. What we want to ensure is that somebody from a different location doesn't come to us the next day and say, hey, I need a SCAT team, when we've just put them on an aircraft and sent them home. So we want to make sure that everybody is aware that these are the resources we're demobilizing, this is why. And another big thing is safety concerns. Once that initial response, the adrenaline that builds up in your system, once that is over, people are tired, people aren't concentrating as much as they used to. We have to make sure that everybody is still carrying out the tasks that they are assigned in a safe manner. Okay, we want to make sure nobody's just throwing the equipment in the back of their truck and heading on home without lashing it properly or doing whatever the safety element is that's required for that. A big thing for us is if we have a team working on a beach for 12 hours during daylight hours, the last thing we want is then for one of those team members to have to drive everybody back to a hotel. If you've worked for 12 hours in that high stressful response location, you've had to make decisions, you've had to work in the heat or the elements. The last thing we want to do is put 6 other people's lives in your hands while you're driving in an area that you're probably not used to, in a country with maybe different rules of the road. So safety concerns is key for us to make sure that everybody is safe all the time. And last but not least, we want to make sure that we are tracking where those resources are. As incident management teams or emergency response teams, we don't lose control, shall we say, of that equipment until it arrives back at its storage location. So we want to make sure that we follow that process all the way through and it gets to where it needs to go. So very similar to the mobilization process, but just in reverse. So best practices. What have we found that works well? Obviously, this is a lot of information, and I'm not expecting everybody to walk away from a 1-hour webinar and go, yep, I know it all, I'm fine now, I can deal with whatever's being thrown at me. If you do feel that way, I absolutely admire your confidence, but I know myself that I do need reminders. One of those reminders for us is clear guidelines. And again, OSRL Response has developed an incident management handbook. There are other great handbooks out there as well that cover the same processes. But they allow us to flip through and see exactly the topics and the areas that we need to concentrate on during the demobilization. And again, this is what it looks like. You can flip through and it will give you checklists and reminders. This is what we need to think about at this time. Regular debriefings, communication, making sure that everybody involved in that demobilization process knows what they're doing and their role within the larger organization. And last but not least, this comprehensive documentation. Keep records. It's absolutely vital, especially when we move on to the final stage, which is conducting our post-incident review. And if you think about it, how are we going to conduct a review on what we did, what our actions were, and how effective we were being during the response if we have nothing to refer to, if we're just relying on our memory? I'm 53 years old now. I can barely remember what I had for breakfast some mornings, let alone what I did in a response 1 or 2 months ago at any particular time. And our notebooks that we use, that we carry out when we do exercises, drills, or actual responses like this, I know it's like show and tell this morning, are vital for us to make sure, oh, okay, so on Wednesday, the 17th of November at 10:30, I did this. I was asked this. This is the information that I was given. This is the decision that I made. So when we conduct these post-incident reviews, we can go through, that was a good decision, that worked well, we should try and build on that, or that actually didn't work as well as I hoped. These are the things that I can do to improve. So why do we conduct reviews? Why? What's the purpose? The incident's over, it's finished. What we need to do is understand what worked well and what didn't. And in any response, there's always going to be things, even if it's an almost perfect response, there's always going to be things, hey, we could have done this a little bit better. And it provides valuable insights for future responses. And this is especially important in teams where we get a turnover of staff. New members come in, older, experienced members move out. And how do we share that experience with our new team members? Well, we can go through the documentation. We go, hey, this incident happened at this location. This is what we did. This worked well. This wasn't very good. And they can benefit from our reviews and add to their knowledge on how we respond to that incident at the facility. So this continuous improvement process is really, really useful to us. And there's 3 ways that we can do our review. The local post-incident review. So this is where the emergency response team, the on-site team that responded to the incident, look at what they did and see for the opportunities, see if there are any opportunities for them to learn. Next, we call it a global post-incident review, but this could be your management team What did they do during the response? What decisions did they make? Did they get enough information? What could have been done better or what worked well? So spread that learning, not just at your facility, but throughout the organization. And maybe if you're part of an industry group like the AUOTT in Trinidad, you could share your experiences with other members. Spread that information. It says break down silos, but build relationships with others within your industry or organization. But once we've done this, it doesn't just stop with a 1 or 2 hour meeting where we do a review. We've got to make sure that we follow that and we take action. So we've identified where we can improve or the information that we get to share and how we then going to implement that knowledge. Do we need more equipment? Do we need more training? Can we spread, hey, this worked really well for us. Everybody could learn from our experiences. So steps, I know, another 6 steps to a good incident review. But if you like this one, I've changed the graphic rather than just a list. So we start off, obviously, when we're going through our post-incident review, the questions that we ask ourselves is, how was the incident detected? And how was it detected? Was it visually? Was it through some monitoring system? How quickly was it detected? And could we detected that earlier? Again, this is just like the steps that we've gone through during this webinar, or these series of webinars. We're just looking at each steps and seeing, can we learn anything from how we did those steps? So, incident identification. How was the alarm raised? Where were the notifications made? Did everybody get the information that they needed? And then the structure of our response team. You know, emergency response teams and incident management teams, especially when you do drills and exercises, we make sure that we have the right people there to deal with the scenario that we faced. But you know as well as I do, incidents happen in the most inconvenient times. In my first 6 years at OSRL Response, I never spent a Christmas or New Year at home. And that's not because my family doesn't like me. It's because that's when incidents happen, okay? Different facilities, they may run on a skeleton staff over the holidays period. Certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, the weather conditions aren't very nice to make sure to want people to go out and keep that constant monitoring of the activities going on. So things happen during those times. So if we only had a reduced crew, how were they structured? Was it sufficient to mount that initial response? And then the process again. Did we follow a process? Did they know what they were doing? Could it be more efficient? Did we have to keep coming back to where our oil spill response equipment stored and get a little thing that we needed? And, oh, we forgot this and we forgot that. Could we make that mobilization process more efficient? Communication, absolutely. Communication is key. How do we inform our stakeholders? What information did they need? Is the information in our plans still up to date? We want to make sure that they were absolutely aware of what it is that we are doing and that they had the necessary information so that they could go away and complete the tasks that they were given. Resource utilization. Not only did we have everything we needed, was it being used in the most effective way? And last but not least, reporting. The records. Did we keep good records? Did everybody have their notes? Did we make sure that we were able, when we went through this process, to refer back to our notes, to our records, and say, okay, so this is what we did at this time. We made this decision. This was the outcome of it. The way that I personally like to do it is to use our tiered preparedness and response wheel. So those 15 different areas of response activities that we look at. Obviously, for different areas, some are relevant, some are not relevant. And we want to identify what worked well in each of these segments. So, for example, the surveillance, modeling, and visualization. Were we able to get people out and make that initial assessment of the incident? Were we able to call on our all-spill modeling team, for example? If you called all-spill response and we did modeling for you, was it delivered to you in a time where it would still be useful? And then were we able to ground truth the information in that modeling with eyes on the ground? We then look at areas for improvement. Are there things that we could do, better planning processes we could put in place? And once we've identified those, we want to make them as specific as possible. So we use the recommendations that come out of our post-incident review and do something with those recommendations. Whether it's, oh, we need to run an exercise, or we need to think about this scenario. We haven't thought about this particular scenario that could happen to us. Let's examine that, run a couple of drills, start thinking about how we would deal with it if it was to occur on site. So that's talking about the implementing lessons learned. And again, it's another process. Integrate the findings. How do we make sure that we communicate what it is that we've found throughout our organization and our key stakeholders? And this not necessarily means, oh, we'll have a meeting and tell everybody. Not everybody learns like that. I know I don't. I know I learn best if I'm faced with this situation. So we could run a drill using that scenario and run through again. Okay, so what would happen if we did this? And make sure that the lessons that we come out are used within that drill and exercise. And that's one of the big things that all-spill response does for many of our members, especially ones that have had an incident. We then run a number of drills and exercises where we tweak that incident just a little bit. We add another complexity onto it, for example, or we reduce the amount of resources they've got available, or something that challenges the team, allows them, remember, to change their initial plan for the response and adapt to the situation that they face. And coming out of all of that, it might tie back into, hey, this incident happened because one of our procedures that we have has missed this vital step, or we've got new people in and they haven't been following the procedures. How do we update not just our all-spill contingency plan or emergency response plan, how we update the procedures at that facility about how a task is done? And then, key to that, how do we get people to follow these updates, to follow the plan? And again, drills and exercises. It's a massive part of what we do at all-spill response, especially with workshops when we tie it into an incident management system training workshop or a response resource evaluation workshop or even a dispersant workshop. We make sure that everybody is aware, okay, this resource is available. This is a scenario that we could face. This is how we would deal with it based upon not just our organization's policies, but also the regulatory policies in that particular area. And for example, about 2 months ago now, I was in Guyana, where we did a workshop with RAC Rempotec, where we examined the national plan. And they were able to call upon oil spill incidents that's happened in the region and gone, okay, if that happened here in Guyana, does this plan allow for that? Does this plan detail how we're going to respond to that incident? And there were certain areas of the plan which absolutely allowed us to deal with that incident, but it was lacking in other areas. So we're able to identify those areas and then put steps in place to close those gaps. Okay, so we've reached the end of this series of webinars. If you stuck it all the way through from the first one, then I salute you. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you've got a lot out of this series of webinars. But again, it doesn't just end here. It's continuous learning. So as we go through the key points or the takeaways from this series of webinars, please be aware that Oil Spill Response is an organization that looks to support you as you go through your oil spill planning and response process. We're actually almost a self-defeating organization. We don't want you to have oil spills. We want you to learn from the lessons, from the incidents that we've been on, implement those lessons to your organizations to make oil spills much less likely to occur in the first place, or if they do, then the response much quicker and more effective. But there are some key points that we've gone through during these 12 steps. Obviously, safety first, ensuring human health and safety, not just of the response personnel, but also of our local population and other key stakeholders. Making sure that during those initial response options, we are working not to put anyone in additional danger. Obviously, second, minimizing the environmental impact. How do we limit the impact that could result from that oil spill? What could we do? What could we establish? How quickly can we respond? And then key to that is this economic considerations. We've been on a number of spills, even just this year, where yes, there has been an environmentally sensitive area around mangroves, for example, or salt marsh, which is very, very high on our environmental assessment scale. But then next to it, there's maybe a port or marina or the actual operation itself that needs to make sure that the operations continue, that they can't shut them down for a period of time, where they can't just stop everything. So we need to make sure that when we're going through those initial response actions, we need to be aware this is the economic effect that will impact how we respond. Demobilization strategies, we've spoke about this. We need to set our goals as early as possible in the response, know what we're trying to achieve. Once we are moving towards that goal, we can then manage our resources. Do we still need all the resources we initially mobilized to that location? Or can we start standing people down? The documentation and reporting, again, is absolutely key. Making sure we keep records of what we are doing. And throughout my trainings, I get people to fill out multiple forms. Again, in the IMO 2 training that I did in Trinidad about 3 weeks ago now with Tiger Tanks, I'm sure the delegates were sick and tired of drawing sketches about sites and filling in forms. What I was trying to tell them was during the training, this is where that information gets embedded into your mind. So it could be later on you go out to a site, it might be a small incident, and you can run through these questions in your head because they're already embedded, and make brief notes in your notebook. about what the situation is and what you need to do. Documentation, reporting, and I'll tie into that communication. And then finally, what we looked at is this post-incident review. This is where we bring everything that we've done together. We look at what caused the incident. We look at how we responded to the incident. And we make sure that we take away any lessons from that incident and use them for future responses and use them to make us a better response organization, or just a better organization in general. And that's what we're aiming for. We want to make sure that we know that if an incident does occur, that we are prepared and ready to respond. So we have 5 minutes left. Like I said, OSRL Response is a global response organization. We are here to help you prepare for and respond to oil spill incidents, wherever and whenever they happen. We have 40 years, over 40 years of experience responding to oil spills in many, many different locations. Even in my personal experience, my first oil spill that I responded to was in 2007 in Greece, on a little beautiful island in Greece, which was a shipping incident. Since then, I've responded to spills in Russia, in Africa, in Europe, obviously over here in the Americas, both North and South. We even did one in Hawaii. So we have a number of experiences that we can draw upon. It's very, very unlikely that you will come to us and say, hey, we have this operation and we've not come across something similar before. So you can reach out to us for advice, for guidance. You can see my email address there at the top, Tristan Barston at OSRL Response. I'm actually part of the Houston Technical Office, myself and Jorge, and Brett, who is our subsea expert, is based here in Houston with Adriana, one of our lead consultants, that is available to give you help and advice on a preparedness level. And that's the office email address, houston@osrlresponse.com. And then we have our vastly experienced duty managers at our 4 key response bases around the world. So that's Singapore, Bahrain, Southampton in the UK, and Fort Lauderdale here in the States. Our duty managers are experienced operational personnel. And if they haven't seen an incident that you are concerned about, or an incident that you've had, or a scenario you're thinking about, they will find somebody within our organization who has, and be able to talk to you in an operationally focused way of, this is what you need to think about. These are the resources that you could think about having ready to go at any particular time. We're also on social media. You can find us on Facebook. We're on LinkedIn, as well as our own pages. We've also got a company page on LinkedIn. We're also on YouTube. There's many different learning webinars and videos. And then we're also on Twitter. Do we call it Twitter now, or is it X now? I'm not sure. Obviously, I'm personally not on Twitter, but I know the organization is. Okay, I can see that there's a question from Dario in the chat. So we're going to finish off. We've got a minute left. So Dario wrote, communities in the affected areas of the spill are often unaware of the criteria for completing a spill response operation and demand more effort. How can we make them understand the importance of the fact that more is not necessarily better, but can be counterproductive in environmental terms? I'm so glad you asked this question, Dario, because we covered this in our IMO2 level training in Trinidad just 3 weeks ago. And we spoke about engaging with the local population in peacetime during the planning phase. We could get them down to do pre-impact assessments, for example, shoreline cleanup operations. You get drinks, what's especially important in Trinidad, you get food and you get drinks. You invite the local population down to a particular area. They do a cleanup where they pick up the refuge that they find on site. Everybody gets together at the end and has food, talks with the organization that's organized the cleanup. So that early engagement is absolutely key, Dario, to make sure that they understand this is the planning that's gone into it. If an oil spill was to occur, this is how we're going to respond. Somebody asked also about the slides. The slides, this webinar actually is being recorded and will be put up on our site. So you can then go to our site, look at the slides, and run through this presentation, this webinar series again. There's another question. What are your thoughts on government officials who prescribe endpoints for cleanup instead of technical advisors such as ITOF, IMO, etc.? Okay, in general, if they are describing endpoints that aren't reasonable, like we discussed earlier on in this presentation, they're not doing it out of spite. They're not doing it just to be difficult. They're doing it because of lack of information on their side. They might not have had the training. They might not have that background knowledge. And a huge way that we find, and we've just done this in Guyana, of making sure that the regulators have that information is to invite them to workshops, to invite them to drills, to exercises. So they see, oh, okay, so this is the incident, this is an achievable endpoint. Now, to be honest, all bets are off if we're coming up to an election cycle where politicians will say anything if they think they will get them votes. But typically, the majority of people that work in the environmental protection agencies or protection departments want to learn, they want to be involved, they want to know that they can make the right decisions. And the great way of doing this is inviting them to workshops, inviting them to your drills and exercises. Okay, so that's the end. Again, I think we might have run out of questions. Thank you very, very much for everybody's time today. I hope you enjoyed this series of webinars. If you do have any questions, please feel free to drop me an email. You can also find me on LinkedIn. There's my contact details there as well. I'm really glad you found it interesting. If you are based in the Americas region and you think, you know what, our area could do with a workshop, then please let us know, suggest. We're planning our 2025 workshop calendar. So now's the time to get in and say, yes, we need you to come to us. Okay, perfect. Thank you very, very much, everybody. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to talking to you all in a preparedness way, obviously, not for a response. Excellent, Sebastian. Let me know when you're going to be in Houston, and we'll definitely make sure that that we meet. Thank you all. Thank you.